In 1986, a small team at Konami was given the large task of producing a video game based on the Phoenix manga, the series considered to be the life's work of Osamu Tezuka, also known as the god of manga. Tezuka is most known worldwide as the creator of Astro Boy, but this game was to be based on the 5th volume of the Phoenix manga known as Hououhen, meaning firebird, but it is also referred to as the Karma chapter. The volume itself deals with themes of suffering, reincarnation, loss, ambition, and consequence. It's kind of a heartbreaking story that was also adapted into an OVA in 1986. The game didn't exactly follow the events of the source material though, and instead took some of the concepts and settings from the manga and transformed them into what is ultimately a very unique and experimental addition to the Famicom library. Is it any good though? And do you need to have watched the OVA or read the manga to fully appreciate it? It's Hinotori, Hououhen, Gaou no Bouken, and it is quite the trip.
When Hindus and Buddhists use the word karma, the basic meaning of it is action, from the Sanskrit root kri, to do. And therefore there is some error in the common translation of karma as a law of cause and effect, or of cosmic retribution. As a man sows, so also shall he reap, has a Western flavor, which is a little causal. The way the Buddha put it was slightly different. This arises, that becomes. Because between this and that, there is a polar relationship.
Hinotori Hououhen Gaou no Bouken translates to Phoenix, Firebird Volume, Gaou's Adventure. It's mostly referred to as just Hinotori, but I think it almost makes more sense in English to refer to it as Gaou's Adventure, or Adventure of Gaou. The title itself kind of resembles Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, as that title in Japanese is Rinku no Bouken. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to refer to it as Hinotori, because that is what it is most commonly known as. In Hinotori, you play as Gaou, a vagabond monk missing an arm and an eye with a troubled past, and troubled past pasts, and troubled futures, plural. We'll get into that. That has a natural gift for expressing his suffering through wood carving. His sprite in the game, though, has 2 arms, seemingly 2 eyes, which in the context of the original story doesn't really make sense. In fact, spoiler alert, he should probably have 0 arms here, if their intent was to prevent an adventure that could have occurred after the events of the source material. But I digress. To fully understand this game, I do think it helps to understand the source material a bit, because some of the themes are heavy to the point where you may not want to play as Gaou. I had moments after watching the OVA where I felt I needed more information, because as a character, Gaou has done some terrible, unforgivable things. However, some of those things are confusing in nature, so I think it ultimately makes a little bit more sense to go over the mechanics of the game first, because it really can be enjoyed without having any knowledge of the anime or the manga whatsoever. It just happened to spark my curiosity as I was playing, and it ended up taking me on a bit of a deep dive, which I think will ultimately allow me to provide you with a little extra insight. Hinotori is a side-scrolling action platformer with shooting and block building mechanics that allow you sandbox-like freedom in the levels and boss battles to place gargoyle sculptures below you. You can then stand atop those structures and place more a la Minecraft. In some ways, it is a bit of a trailblazer in that sense, because it gives you a kind of building and crafting freedom that I have not seen anything close to so far in Retro Odyssey. The closest thing would probably be placing multiple bombs in Bomberman with the timer. The goal of the game is to collect 16 fragments of a tapestry representing the Phoenix, which in turn represents reincarnation. Each of the 16 levels ends upon collecting one of those art fragments. The levels themselves end either with a boss fight or a bit of a puzzle, if you can call it that, or an event to navigate through in order to retrieve the art fragment. But it's not quite as simple as making your way through the levels in order. True to the title of this game, it is an adventure after all. And you'll have to do some exploring to find secret exits in certain levels to escape one of 3 main loops, with one final detached portion. You see, Hinotori takes place over several eons: feudal Japan, prehistory, and the distant future. This mirrors the nature of the Phoenix manga, which contains separate, self-contained stories that take place in wildly different eras. The secret exits are not at all difficult to find, but some of them require an understanding of the game's controls that would not be immediately obvious without the manual. At first, the controls feel very standard for platforming, but you do feel like a bit of a hefty boy. Gaou is certainly husky. He's also quite built. A jumps and B makes Gaou fire a chisel, which can then turn enemies into materials to create more gargoyle blocks to stand on. What's also cool is if the block materials are moving away from you and you manage to hit that with another chisel, you can reverse the direction, and you can repeat that process to get free points, but the points are ultimately meaningless. To create one of these blocks, you just need to hold down and press B. This either places it directly in front of the player or directly below, depending on whether or not Gaou is on solid ground or he's in the air. These statues can also affect the pathfinding of enemies and even bosses. They can be used to make your own path, to save you from falling to death, and to avoid areas with lots of enemies. One thing that took me longer than it should have, though, is to figure out that you can actually fire your chisels up into the air. For some reason, I just assumed that it was only going to be left and right. I think because in Goemon, it's only left and right. Or is it? No, actually, I'm wrong. What am I thinking? And the most convoluted mechanic that you are very unlikely to discover on your own is that while crouching, if you jump 3 times quickly, you will break the block below you if it is destructible, which is required in some instances to access hidden exits that you need to find in order to beat the game. Also, don't press select unless you get stuck, because it's essentially a button to spend a life and restart a given stage in the event that you made a mistake, or you want to search more for a hidden exit. Along the way, there are a good amount of enemies and items as well that add even more spice to the formula, both of which remind me a lot of Goemon's and King Kong 2's structures. A large variety of enemies that aren't terribly different from one another, and items that either are one-time use or act as kind of a pseudo upgrade or level up for your player character. I say pseudo because when you die, you lose a lot of these things and you have to recollect them. It's very similar to Goemon. It might use the same engine, kind of like I suspect King Kong 2 did. There is one enemy known as the Evil Spirit that is found consistently through all the different regions, but for the most part, enemies are sectioned off into specific loops, like the Feudal Japan loop, or the Future loop, or the Prehistory loop. The snakes, the owls, the foxes, the officials, there's not too much to say here. The thieves can get pretty annoying, especially if they get under you, which they can in certain things, and probably the most annoying to me were the koi, because they can just start jumping up like crazy, and if there are too many sprites on screen, it's gonna lag the game a little bit. The Future World enemies are even more unremarkable. The mecha bees, mecha pillbugs, amoebas, meekratites, crux, Quasil, and missiles. They're all just kind of like, you know, they're there. You spend a lot less time in Future World than you do in the prehistory or the feudal Japan stages, at least in my experience. And so like these enemies are just kind of whatever. The crux are probably my favorite just because they have that endless pursuit of you. And then in prehistory, you have the Archaeopteryx, the turtle, the Anatosaurus, the Tyrannosaurus, and giant ants. And that doesn't include the object sort of enemies that exist in this game. Rocks, moai, meteors, logs, and icicles. And then on top of that, you have a very expansive variety of bosses, but I'll touch more on those when I get to the stages. Let me just say though that the bosses in this game are actually a lot of fun. They're not punishingly difficult. They have interesting patterns, unique designs. You know what? I'm gonna just talk about them now. The Gargoyle boss is a lot of fun. The Rockman looks awesome. The face wheel, also extremely cool. A lot of these are easier if you can kind of section them off. There's a wall boss in the Hanya and Kuni one, and this actually took me a few tries because those little guys that are floating around are pretty difficult. It kind of reminded me of Castlevania a little bit. The Lightning God is potentially the coolest boss in the entire game, and I beat him the first time before I realized that I could throw my chisel up. And so, I mean, like, I felt really good. It felt like a better put together version of encountering a Red Devil in Ghosts and Goblins. And then the Face Wheel is another one of those wall type bosses. A little less memorable, you have the Bible, the Hidden Sphere, the Supercomputer, and the Rakubu. But the Dino Fossil is one of the most gorgeous put together bosses, sprite wise, I think, so far in the game. I love that style. It's great. So there's like lots of variety in Hinotori. There's lots of interesting mechanics with the placing of blocks and such. Now, the items in this game you'll find in treasure chests. They fall from the sky or they can be found on the ground. Sometimes you have to position yourself in an interesting way to try and hit them, which is a really cool mechanic. You don't just walk into them. You have to think, not a lot, just a little bit. But sometimes there are items that, like, you know you're gonna have to walk off an edge and place a hidden block below you to get, and it's a risk. And the fact that there is risk reward, I find really entertaining. And I think to the game's benefit, there aren't too many items. It has like just the right amount. Goemon went a little overboard. This is a little more manageable. The Doll of Gaou essentially acts as a 1-up, and this has to be the cutest 1-up in any game I've played so far. The Beaded Necklace is essentially the rosary from Castlevania. It transforms all enemies on screen into blocks, and I do find it a little more useful than the Rosary Cross because often picking up the Rosary Cross happens right before you're transitioning to a new room anyway. The Onigiri return from Goemon, and they restore all of Gao's health. The Onigiri are clutch, and knowing where to find an Onigiri can make or break your progression through a level. The shell is one of those pseudo upgrades to Gao where it increases his health by 1 bar. And you can get a good number of these, but when you die, you lose those. But what I like about Hinotori is that the game is never challenging to the point where you just can't do it without those upgrades. So it's not like worth restarting or anything your run if you do end up dying. I died a few times in the run that I beat the game on, and I would just recommend pressing on if you plan to play this. The red or discolored gargoyle blocks give you more materials for building those gargoyle blocks. The pouches just give you bonus score. And then the last two are the feather, which is essentially the star from Mario, and the necklace, which freezes enemies, not just the ones off screen, but for a specific amount of time so that if you continue through the level, you'll still bump into enemies, and I think that's really cool. And the mirror, which allows Gao to pass through the actual blocks of the stage like a ghost. So that's just about everything to do with the structure of the game. I do want to talk more about my experience, but differently than other games I've played so far, my experience kind of spans 3 different mediums here: the manga, the anime, and the game. So the first time I tried playing this game, it seemed pretty straightforward, and I could have left it at that, but I wanted to know more about it personally. I wanted to know more about Gao and more about what the story was, since the summaries online were sparse and somewhat inconsistent. And I have to say, the story is wild. The Karma volume of Phoenix takes place in the Nara period of Japan, which spans 710 and 794 AD. It primarily follows 2 characters whose lives appear to be intertwined by fate. The first is Gao, a bandit later turned monk, and the second is Kanemaru, an ambitious sculptor. The story begins with tragedy. On the day of Gao's birth, his father leaves with him in his arms and begins to rush him to the top of a nearby mountain in order to give thanks to the mountain spirit. But while climbing to the peak, he slips and falls down a cliff with his newborn Gao wrapped in a blanket. Gao's father passed away, and Gao himself was left permanently disabled with the loss of an arm and an eye. His village then treats him as an outcast due to his disabilities, and after years of unfair treatment, Gao murders another villager named Doro after he suspects he sabotaged the food he won in a contest of strength, and the village chases him out. This is around when the second protagonist enters the narrative, Kanemaru. Kanemaru witnesses Gao being chased by the villagers accusing him of murder and goes off into the woods. His fire attracts Gao though, and Kanemaru hides upon Gao approaching, but seeing his nature, decided to make himself present. Gao calmly eats his food and then injures his arm because he hates to see people with too good good arms and says it's Akanemaru's own fault for luring him there with the fire. Since Akanemaru was a sculptor by trade, this injury was especially difficult for him to bear. From here, Gaou and Akanemaru's paths separate, but their paths intertwine throughout the rest of the story, and this was the moment that set their paths in motion. Akanemaru's story continues as he takes some time to himself in a nearby monastery where he slowly regains his skill to sculpt. He hones his skill and ends up more talented than before, and very in tune with his work. He also meets a young spunky girl named Bushi, who ultimately becomes a bit of a love interest for Akanemaru. He goes on to make a name for himself through carving, and a local lord impressed with his work sends him on a mission to sculpt the legendary phoenix. He fails to find sufficient visual representation of the phoenix for inspiration though, and instead carves a statue of the goddess of mercy using Bushi as his model. He is then forcefully separated from Bushi and forced to come with the servants of the Lord to court as his time had run out. Bushi is left severely injured but survives. When in court to be tried and executed for his crime and failing to produce an adequate sculpture of the phoenix, Akanemaru is saved by another powerful patron who then gives him access to a tapestry of the phoenix, which is the basis for the tapestry in the game. Upon seeing it, Akanemaru is taken on a spiritual trip, and this he is unknowingly given a preview of his next few reincarnations. First, a tiny sea creature that gets consumed almost instantaneously, then a turtle who lives a long and happy life, and then a small bird who finally meets the phoenix. He awakes from this somewhat mad and confused, but now possessing what he needs to represent the phoenix in sculpture form. He is then placed in charge of the project to create an enormous Buddha sculpture in the capital. This sculpture can actually still be found today in Nara Park, Japan, at Todaiji Temple. During those events for Akanemaru, Gao's path was quite a bit different. After leaving Akanemaru wounded in the forest, Gaou went on to live a life as a bandit, murdering, stealing, and never staying in one place for too long. That journey changes a bit when he meets a strange woman named Hayame in the forest and kidnaps her and forces her to live with him and essentially be his wife. Hayame helps Gaou and brings him a sense of happiness, and she also cares for him as his nose begins to become diseased and lumpy, which is actually the result of the decisions of Saruta, a different incarnation of Gaou whose actions retroactively cursed all of his incarnations. During a raid, one of Gao's companions suggests that the medicine Hayame was making for his nose was actually poison, and that she was trying to kill him to get revenge on him for kidnapping her. Gao's rage gets the best of him, and without questioning, he slaughters Hayame. In that moment, he learns that she had been saved by him before. Hayame was actually a ladybug, and was a form of a spirit or yokai that just wanted to live with him and love him. Gaou has a flashback to this exact moment and is filled with regret, and from that moment on becomes a truly broken man. After being captured finally as a murderer, Gaou is sentenced to servitude to a traveling monk by the name of Shonen Robin. From here, Gaou undergoes a spiritual transformation. Gaou blames society for how he turned out, but the monk blames karma. You bear no responsibility for what you've become. The cycle of transmigration of souls is to blame. You may have been human once too, perhaps millions of years ago, or in the distant future. The fact that you had to kill people and that you suffer with that hideous nose may be retribution for your actions in your former life. Despite being a monk, Shonen Robin discloses to Gaou his belief that the government is only using Buddhism as a vehicle for more power, and shortly after, Gaou runs away for a bit, processing. He comes across a village being tormented by evil spirits and is asked to scare them away, and he carves them some gargoyles that are utterly grotesque. He channels his internal struggle and anger into his sculpture and produces uncannily expressive pieces. Shonen Robin tells Gaou he believes that it is his calling to sculpt. At one point, Gaou and Shonen Robin are apprehended and locked away in a dungeon due to a misunderstanding over Gao's past, as people suspect he is guilty of a crime. While Shonen Robin is released somewhat quickly, Gaou is kept imprisoned and tortured to get a confession which never comes. When Gaou is finally released from captivity, the guards are beside themselves as light enters the dungeon and they see his many carvings. Now, if you had only watched the anime, Gao's journey is entirely ignored after killing Hayame, so you would have no clue what had been going on over the years in which he underwent a spiritual transformation. Gao's and Akanemaru's paths cross again after Gaou is captured by a lord who suspects he is a better sculptor than Akanemaru and better suited to head spearhead the production of the giant Buddha project. They are both brought to court and subject to a contest, in which they will have 1 week to create a sculpture of the phoenix. Over the course of the Buddha project, Akinamaru had begun to lose his way. He had been confronted by a spiritual form of Bushi who asks him why he lost his way. And it's clear he's become more concerned with fame than with art. He is concerned about making a name for himself in history, and as a result, his art suffers. During the 7-day competition, Akinamaru struggles to find adequate inspiration, but pulls through with a gorgeous sculpture regardless. Gaou, on the other hand, is confronted by the phoenix itself. He is shown the pain and suffering he experiences in past and future reincarnations. He is shown as a perpetual sufferer. He is left shook by the experience, and the phoenix tells him to use his pain to create, and he does. In court, they reveal their work. First, Akinamaru, then Gaou. The court finds Akinamaru's piece to be amazing, but they are left speechless by Gaou's.
なぜだなぜこやつが
Frustrated and facing defeat, Akinamaru discloses to the court that Gaou had robbed and butchered him, and that caused him immense hardship, and that he should not be allowed to work on the Buddha as he does not exemplify or live by Buddhist values. The court agrees and sentenced Gaou to have his other arm amputated per Akinamaru's request. Gaou is tossed out of the city, and Akinamaru is declared the winner. His sculpture is placed in the temple. But that evening, the sculpture combusts and burns the temple down with Akinamaru inside. He is confronted with the phoenix and pleads with it to be reborn as a human again so he can complete his dream of sculpting the phoenix. But his request is denied. He is told that he will never become human again and that his next incarnation will be a fish. Gaou is eventually tracked down by Bushi, who collected Akinamaru's remains and asked Gaou if she would help give him a proper burial. Gaou continued to sculpt and help others with his mouth and feet, and it is said that he eventually became a Tengu. It's a lot to process, and it's confusing without some prior knowledge of Buddhism, but I found it quite compelling and moving despite that. When first watching the anime, I felt it extremely unfair that Akinamaru was never allowed to be human again, as Gaou's crimes were far worse and more numerous. But upon going through it a few times and doing some outside research, I found it's not really about fairness. In this perspective, things simply are. Action carries on from one life to the next, and the wheel of life continues. So, final thoughts on the manga, the anime, and the game. Hinotori Hououhen. The manga is a masterpiece. I learned more from reading that about differences in the ideas of reincarnation between like more traditional Eastern Buddhist thought and then how Western interpretations kind of differ. And I learned more about what karma actually means to a lot of people, and that it is just that the actions from one life carry over to the next. It is the actions that extend and carry on. And Gaou, unfortunately, is a perpetual sufferer constantly under trial. And I think a lot of us can feel like that at times. He's done awful things, objectively worse things than I've ever done, but for some reason, his character resonates with me. I'm not sure exactly why, but it does. The anime, on the other hand, can only be fully appreciated if you understand what the entire story is. However, I do think it is worth watching, and it is just on YouTube. These IPs are old enough to where people just don't really care about protecting them anymore, I don't think. But then, most importantly to the context of this series, the game. I had a really good experience with Hinotori Hououhen Gaou no Bouken. I was pleasantly surprised because first picking it up, it does feel just a little rough around the edges. A lot of the sprite work and the textures, if you can call them that, they look a little rough, a little too repeated, but the variety in the backgrounds and the variety in the different eras that you travel through kind of make up for that. And I genuinely enjoyed going through all of the levels. I had to stop myself several times as I was playing because I was just like, man, I'm really enjoying this. I'm having fun. It is not a great game. It's not anywhere close to something like Castlevania, Metroid, Zelda, some of the all-time classics that I've played so far. But for fans of 8-bit games, or fans of Tezuka or the Phoenix series, this is worth checking out. Even if you're just curious about what it's like to build those blocks, it's worth checking out. It's a very inexpensive game. And it's another one of those Konami games where they took a license and they actually did something cool with it. I think that this delivered far more than King Kong 2 did. But to be fair, the source material for King Kong 2 was garbage. Playing through the game and reading everything and watching everything has really given me a little bit more to think about than I usually would after some of these experiences. Overall, Hinotori is a good game, and it's worth checking out because it's inexpensive, it does lots of interesting and unique things, the music isn't annoying, and it does kind of border on that hidden gem sort of territory. I still don't feel I have discovered a full hidden gem myself, because it is just good in my opinion at the end of the day. It isn't amazing despite doing some really impressive things. So before I go to answer the two questions I posed in the very beginning, is it any good? Yes. And do you need to know about the source material in order to fully enjoy it? Fully? Yes. But to enjoy it? No. And I'll leave you with this.
A person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts. So he loses touch with reality and lives in a world of illusions. By thoughts, I mean specifically chatter in the skull, perpetual and compulsive repetition of words, of reckoning and calculating. I'm not saying that thinking is bad. Like everything else, it's useful in moderation. A good servant, but a bad master. And all so-called civilized peoples have increasingly become crazy and self-destructive because through excessive thinking they have lost touch with reality. That's to say, we confuse signs, words, numbers, symbols, and ideas with the real world. Most of us would have rather money than tangible wealth, and a great occasion is somehow spoiled for us unless photographed. And to read about it the next day in the newspaper is oddly more fun for us than the original event. This is a disaster. For as a result of confusing the real world of nature with mere signs, such as bank balances and contracts, we are destroying nature. We are so tied up in our minds that we've lost our senses. Time to wake up. What is reality? Obviously, no one can say, because it isn't words. It isn't material, that's just an idea. It isn't spiritual. That's also an idea, a symbol. Reality is this.